Marcus Johnson stood in the airport terminal with his green Marine uniform still fresh and sharp from his long flight. 20 years he had given to the military, and now he was finally coming home. His mother was waiting for him somewhere in the crowd outside, and he could almost hear her excited voice in his head. He carried only a small duffel bag over his shoulder, nothing fancy or expensive. Just the things a soldier brings home after serving his country far away. The airport was busy like always. People moved in all directions, pushing carts filled with suitcases, rushing to meet loved ones or running to catch their next flight. Marcus moved slowly through the baggage claim area, still tired from the long journey. His body felt heavy, and his mind was still thinking about the last months overseas. He did not know that everything was about to change in a way that would hurt him forever. That is when he first noticed the men watching him. There were 3 of them standing near the baggage carousel, and they were not trying to hide the fact that they were looking at him. One of them spoke quietly to the others and pointed in Marcus's direction. Marcus felt something cold move through his body. He had been trained in many things during his military service, but training could not stop the feeling that something was wrong. These men did not look like regular security. They wore regular clothes, but there was something about the way they stood and the way they looked that told Marcus they were police officers of some kind. Marcus tried not to stare at them. He focused on getting his bag and moved toward the exit. He told himself that maybe they were just doing their job, checking everyone in the airport. Maybe it was normal, but his 20 years of experience and his training told him something different. His instincts were telling him to be careful. The 3 men started moving toward him. They walked quickly and their faces were hard and serious. Marcus could see now that one of them had his hand resting near his belt, where a weapon would be. This was not good. Marcus stopped walking and tried to look calm, even though his heart was beating faster. "Hey," one of the men called out to him. "Yeah, you. Stop right there." Marcus stopped. He did not run. He did not make any sudden movements. This was what he had been taught to do. When police officers say to stop, a person should stop and be polite. Marcus turned to face them slowly. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked in a calm voice. The 3 men got closer. They were now standing very close to Marcus, and they did not seem friendly. The first man, who seemed to be the one in charge, spoke roughly. "We are looking for a suspect," the man said. "We got reports of a robbery a few blocks from here. The suspect is a black male, 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothes. You match the description." Marcus listened to this, and he felt confused and angry at the same time. He was wearing a bright green military uniform. He was carrying a military bag. He had just arrived at the airport a few minutes ago. How could he match the description of someone who robbed a place a few blocks away? "Sir, I just landed," Marcus said politely. "I have been on an airplane for many hours. I have my military ID and my boarding pass. I can show you. I did not rob anyone." But the officers did not seem to listen. They did not seem to care about what Marcus was saying. The first officer's face got darker and angrier. "We did not ask you to talk back," the officer said. "Put your bag down now." Marcus put his bag down slowly. Other people in the airport were starting to look at what was happening. Some people took out their phones. They could see something bad was about to happen. "Get on the ground," the second officer said, and his hand was now clearly on his weapon. "Now, get down on the ground." Marcus did what they asked. He had been trained to follow orders. He knew that fighting with police officers would only make things worse. He got down on his knees and then lay flat on the ground. His uniform, which he was so proud of, was now touching the dirty airport floor. "I did not do anything," Marcus said again, trying to stay calm. "Please check my ID. Please check my boarding pass. I am a Marine. I served my country for 20 years. The first officer stepped over Marcus and kicked his duffel bag away. The third officer was speaking into a radio on his shoulder, telling someone that they had found the suspect. But Marcus was not the suspect. Marcus was a soldier who had just come home. The officers were very rough now. They pulled Marcus's arms behind his back and were putting something on his wrists. But Marcus could see that the officers were looking at each other in a confused way. They seemed to be realizing that something was wrong. This man was really wearing a military uniform. This man really did have a military bag. This man really did have military ID. But it was too late. One of the officers seemed angry or scared, or maybe both. Marcus heard a sound that he had heard many times in war. It was the sound of a gun being pulled out of its holder. Marcus's training told him what was about to happen. and he tried to move, tried to say something, but his body was on the ground and his hands were held behind his back. The first shot hit Marcus in his back. The pain was like nothing he had ever felt. It was worse than any pain from his time in the military. Then came the second shot. And then there was only darkness and pain and the sound of people screaming in the airport. Marcus Johnson, the decorated Marine veteran who had survived 20 years of service and had just come home to his mother, fell on the dirty floor of the airport. His green uniform was now red with blood. The officers who shot him stood there looking down at him, maybe finally starting to understand what they had done. But it was already too late. Everything had changed in just a few minutes. Everything had changed forever. The sound of sirens filled the airport within minutes. Ambulances came racing to the scene, their red lights flashing and their alarms wailing loudly. Medical workers moved quickly to Marcus, who was lying on the ground still and not moving. There was blood all around him. The workers moved with serious faces and quick hands, knowing that every second mattered. They put Marcus on a stretcher and carried him to the ambulance. He was not awake. He was barely alive. People who had seen what happened stood in the airport with shocked faces. Some of them had recorded the whole thing on their phones. They had seen a man in a military uniform shot by 3 police officers. They had seen police officers kick a man who was not fighting them. They had seen something that did not seem right or fair. Many of these people were angry. Many of them were scared. The 3 officers who had shot Marcus stood there looking confused and shocked. They seemed to suddenly understand that they had made a very big mistake. But instead of admitting the mistake, they began to talk quietly to each other. They began to create a different story about what had happened. When the police captain arrived at the airport an hour later, the 3 officers told him their version of what happened. They said that Marcus had been armed and dangerous. They said that Marcus had reached for a weapon. They said that Marcus had lunged at them and that they feared for their lives. They said that they had no choice but to shoot. All of this was a lie, but they told it anyway. The police captain held a press conference later that day. He spoke to news reporters and people watching on their phones and computers. He told the same story that the 3 officers had told him. He said that the police had acted in self-defense. He said that Marcus was a threat. He made it sound like the police officers had done nothing wrong. He made it sound like shooting an unarmed man in a military uniform was the right thing to do. But people who had been at the airport knew the truth. They knew what they had seen. They knew that the police captain and the officers were not telling the truth. The videos they had recorded on their phones showed something very different from what the police were saying. In the videos, Marcus was on the ground. In the videos, Marcus was not armed. In the videos, Marcus was doing what the officers told him to do. The videos showed the real story. Meanwhile, Marcus was in the hospital fighting for his life. Doctors worked on him for many hours. They removed the bullets from his body. They tried to repair the damage that the bullets had done. The surgery was very long and very difficult. When it was finally over, Marcus was moved to a room in the hospital, but he did not wake up. He stayed asleep, his body still and quiet with tubes and machines helping him breathe and keeping him alive. Marcus's mother, Sarah Johnson, had been waiting at the airport to pick up her son. She was so happy and excited. She had not seen Marcus for many months. She had counted the days until he would come home. But instead of seeing her son walk out of the airport terminal smiling, she got a phone call that made her world fall apart. The voice on the phone told her that her son had been shot by police. The voice told her that he was in the hospital. The voice did not tell her if he would live or die. Sarah drove to the hospital as fast as she could. Her hands shook on the steering wheel. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could hardly breathe. When she got to the hospital, she ran inside and found her son lying in a bed connected to many machines. He looked so small and so hurt. Her beautiful son, who had served his country and come home safe from 20 years in the military, had been shot by the police in his own country. Sarah sat next to Marcus's bed and held his hand. She cried. She prayed. She told her son stories about his childhood. She told him that she loved him. She did not know if he could hear her, but she talked to him anyway. She promised him that she would find out why this had happened, and that she would make sure people knew the truth. News about the shooting spread quickly. Some news stations repeated what the police had said. They said that police had shot an armed suspect in self-defense, But other news stations, especially those that looked more carefully at the videos, told a different story. They showed the videos. They told people what really happened. They said that police had shot an unarmed man. They said that police had lied about what happened. The 3 officers who had shot Marcus were sent home on paid leave while an investigation was done. This meant that they would still get paid their money while they sat at home. Many people in the community were very angry about this. People in the black community especially felt that this was unfair. They felt that the officers should have been arrested immediately. They felt that the system was protecting police officers even when they did something very wrong. Protesters gathered outside the hospital. They carried signs that said Marcus matters and no justice, no peace. They were angry about what had happened to Marcus, and they were angry that the officers had not been arrested. They were angry about all the other times that police had shot black men, and nothing had happened to the officers. This was not just about Marcus anymore. This was about a bigger problem in America. Day after day, Marcus lay in his hospital bed. His mother stayed beside him. The machines kept him alive. The doctors waited to see if he would wake up. The rest of the country watched and waited and argued about what the truth really was. But one thing was becoming clear. The story that the police had told was not true. The truth was being discovered, and soon everyone would know it. At the Marine Corps headquarters, something important was happening. When a soldier gets hurt by police, or when something serious happens to a soldier who is on leave or who has finished serving, the military pays attention. The Marine Corps received the report about Marcus Johnson being shot by police. They received this report very quickly within hours of the shooting. The military commander in charge did not wait around. He immediately gave an order to the Marine Criminal Investigation Command, or CID as people called it. This group of investigators was trained to look into crimes and things that went wrong. They were very good at their job, and they did not accept lies or easy answers. The CID investigators arrived at the airport and began their work immediately. They were different from the local police investigation. These investigators were trained military people. They had no connection to the local police. They had no reason to protect the local police officers. They were only interested in finding out what really happened to Marcus Johnson, who was one of their own. The investigators looked at everything. They looked at the place where the shooting happened. They measured distances and looked for physical evidence. They looked at the cameras in the airport. The airport had many cameras in every direction, and these cameras had recorded everything. The investigators watched the videos carefully. They saw exactly what happened. They saw Marcus in his military uniform. They saw him lying on the ground. They saw the 3 officers. They saw that Marcus had no weapon. They saw the officers shoot him while he was on the ground and not fighting them. What they saw was very different from what the police had said happened. The investigators also talked to people who had been at the airport. They found people who had been there when the shooting happened. They found people who had seen everything. These people told the investigators what they had really seen, not what the police said had happened. Many of these people had also recorded the shooting on their phones. They gave these recordings to the investigators. The investigators watched all of these videos, and all of them told the same story. The police had lied. The investigators looked at other evidence too. They found no weapon near Marcus. They found no evidence that Marcus had anything to hurt anyone with. They found no evidence that Marcus had done anything wrong. Everything they found showed that the shooting was not something that had to happen. It was not self-defense. It was a mistake or something worse. The investigators also looked into the records of the 3 officers who had shot Marcus. This is where they found very important information. The first officer, named Dale Peterson, had a history of problems. He had been accused of using too much force against people before. He had been accused of stopping people just because they were black. There had been many complaints about him, but the police department had not done anything serious about these complaints. He had been told to go to training, and that was it. He had kept his job and kept doing the same things. The second officer, named James Mitchell, had a similar history. He too had complaints about using too much force. He too had complaints about racial profiling. These were not new officers making one mistake. These were officers who had a pattern of doing bad things. The third officer, named David Chen, did not have as many complaints, but he was friends with the other 2 officers. The investigators began to understand that these 3 officers worked together and had done this kind of thing before. But the most important investigation was into Marcus's own background. The investigators looked at his military record. They read all about his 20 years of service. They read about his medals and his awards. They read about the times he had been brave and done things that helped other people. Marcus had never been in trouble in the military. Marcus was a good soldier. Marcus was someone who followed rules and did his duty. Marcus was not a danger to anyone. All of this was written clearly in his record. The military investigators shared all of their findings with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI. The FBI had a special section that looked into cases where police officers had violated the civil rights of people. The FBI understood that this was a federal crime, not just a local police matter. A police officer breaking a person's civil rights in a way that hurt them was a federal crime. It was the kind of crime that the FBI dealt with. The FBI investigators added their own work to what the military had found. They looked at national databases. They looked at records of the 3 officers in other places. They found that these officers had been involved in other questionable situations. They found that there were national patterns of police officers like these committing crimes and not being punished. The federal investigators worked with lawyers and judges. They prepared a case that showed clear evidence. They had the videos. They had the witness statements. They had the physical evidence. They had the records of the officers and their history of problems. The case was very strong. It was clear that what the officers had done was wrong. It was clear that they had lied about what happened. It was clear that they had shot an unarmed man who was not a threat. The decision was made at the highest levels of the federal government and the military. The 3 officers would be arrested. They would be charged with federal crimes. They would face federal court, not local court. They would not be protected by the local police system that had been trying to cover up what they had done. This news was like lightning hitting the police department. The leadership did not expect this. They thought the case was closed. They thought the officers would not face any real punishment, just like so many times before when police officers had shot people and nothing had happened. But this time was different. This time there was the military involved. This time there was the federal government involved. This time the truth was going to come out and no one could hide it. It was early in the morning when the federal agents arrived at the police station. They came in unmarked cars, black vehicles with dark windows. No sirens, no big show. Just quiet and serious. The federal agents got out of their cars and walked into the police station. They had papers in their hands. These papers were arrest warrants. These papers gave them the legal right to take the 3 officers into custody. The police captain and the leadership at the station did not know this was coming. They had no warning. They thought everything was fine. They thought the investigation by the local police was moving forward and everything would be okay, but they were wrong. They were going to be shocked. The federal agents walked up to the desk where people reported for work. They asked to see Dale Peterson, James Mitchell, and David Chen. The captain was called to come down to the front of the station. When he arrived and saw the federal agents with their badges and their serious faces, he knew something bad was happening. "We are federal agents," one of the agents said. "We have arrest warrants for Officer Dale Peterson, Officer James Mitchell, and Officer David Chen. We are here to take them into custody." The captain's face went white. He did not know what to say. The federal agents did not ask permission. They did not wait for the captain to agree. They went to find the 3 officers. The 3 officers were in a room in the police station talking about the investigation. They were probably feeling good about themselves. They probably thought that they were going to get away with what they had done. They probably thought that the investigation would clear them. But when the federal agents came to the door of the room and told them they were under arrest, everything changed. The handcuffs that Dale Peterson, James Mitchell, and David Chen now wore were the same kind of handcuffs that they had used on Marcus Johnson. The agents read them their rights, just like they were supposed to do. The officers tried to talk, tried to explain, but the agents were not interested in their explanations right now. They had arrest warrants and evidence, and that was all they needed. The 3 officers were taken out of the police station. News helicopters had arrived in the sky above the police station. People had found out that something was happening. Camera crews were waiting outside. The whole city, the whole country even, was watching on television and on their phones to see what would happen next. When the 3 officers came out of the police station in handcuffs, the cameras flashed and recorded everything. Here were 3 police officers being arrested just like any other criminal. They were being treated just like they had treated Marcus Johnson. They were being put in federal vehicles. They were being taken away. The officers tried to hide their faces. They tried not to look at the cameras, but they could not hide what was happening. The images went on television immediately. News broadcasters talked about it. News websites wrote about it. Social media filled up with the images. The whole world was watching. People who had been angry about Marcus being shot now felt something different. They felt hope. They felt like maybe, just maybe, the system could work. They felt like police officers could actually be held responsible for what they did. In cities all over the country, people watched this happen and felt emotions they had not felt in a long time. They felt like justice was possible, but the officers and their supporters felt different. They felt angry. Some people said that the officers were being treated unfairly. Some people said that the officers were just doing their job, and now they were being attacked. Some people tried to say that the officers were victims. But even many people who usually supported police officers knew that this time was different. This time there was just too much evidence. This time the officers had done something very wrong. The local police union said they would defend the officers. They said they would pay for lawyers for the officers. They said that the federal government was being unfair, but everyone could see the videos. Everyone knew that the officers had lied. Everyone understood that the officers had shot a man who was not a threat. The 3 officers were taken to federal jail to wait for their trial. They sat in cells like any other criminals. They waited for the federal court to decide what would happen to them. They were no longer officers. They were now defendants in a federal case. At the police station, there was confusion and upset feeling. The commander had to answer questions about what had happened. He had to explain why his officers had shot Marcus Johnson. He had to explain why they had lied about what happened. He had to explain why the department had accepted their lies without question. There were no good answers to these questions. At the hospital, when Sarah Johnson heard that the 3 officers had been arrested, she sat next to her son's bed and cried. But this time she cried a little differently. There was still sadness and hurt, but there was also something else. There was anger finally being answered. There was justice maybe starting to happen. She held her son's hand and told him that the men who had hurt him had been arrested. She did not know if he could hear her, but she told him anyway. She promised him that she would see this through. She promised him that the truth would win. The arrest of the 3 officers was like a turning point. It was like the moment when everything changed direction. Before this moment, it seemed like the police were going to protect their own officers and nothing was going to happen to them. But now federal law had stepped in. Now real consequences were coming. Now the system was being forced to do the right thing. Now everyone could see that what had seemed impossible before was actually possible. The 3 officers who shot Marcus Johnson would have to answer for what they did. They would face a trial. They would face a judge and a jury. They would face real consequences. Finally, after all the waiting and hoping and fighting, justice seemed like it might actually happen. 3 weeks after the shooting, Marcus Johnson opened his eyes. His mother was sitting right next to him, holding his hand like she had been doing every single day. When his eyes opened and she saw him looking at her, Sarah cried out with joy and sadness mixed together. She called for the doctors and nurses immediately. The doctors came running. They checked Marcus. They asked him questions. He could not talk yet because his body was still very hurt and his throat had tubes in it, but he was awake. He was alive. After all those days of lying still and quiet, Marcus Johnson was back in the world. The doctors told him through hand signals and by writing things down that he had been shot. They told him that he had been in the hospital for a long time. They told him that police officers had done this to him. They told him that these officers had been arrested. They told him that there would be a trial. Marcus understood that his life had changed forever in that moment at the airport. Slowly, over many weeks, Marcus began to get better. He could eat a little food. He could talk in a quiet voice. He could move his arms and legs more. The pain was still very bad, and the doctors said he would need many months of recovery. But he was getting better. He was going to live. During all this time, while Marcus was getting better, the federal court was preparing for the trial of the 3 officers. The prosecutors, who are the lawyers who work for the government, prepared their case very carefully. They had all the evidence. They had videos. They had photographs. They had witness statements. They had the records of the officers showing their history of racial profiling and using too much force. The case was very strong. The lawyers for the 3 officers tried to create doubt. They tried to say that maybe what happened was not what it looked like. They tried to say that their clients were afraid. They tried to say that they were just doing their job. But every argument they made was stopped by evidence. Every video showed that the officers were lying. Every witness said that Marcus had not done anything wrong. The trial took place in federal court. The prosecutor stood in front of the judge and jury and told them what had happened. She explained carefully, step by step, what the officers had done. She showed the videos. People in the jury watched and saw Marcus in his military uniform. They saw him lying on the ground. They saw him with no weapon. They saw the officers shoot him. They heard the gunshots. They saw him bleeding. Witnesses came to the trial. People who had been at the airport told what they had seen. They described how the officers had acted. They described how Marcus had done nothing wrong. They described how the officers shot him anyway. Then Marcus came to the trial. He came in a wheelchair. His mother pushed him into the courtroom. He was still recovering from his wounds. He was still in pain, but he came to tell the truth about what had happened to him. He described being at the airport. He described showing his military ID. He described following the officer's orders and getting on the ground. He described the moment he heard the gunshots and felt the bullets hit him. He described the pain and the darkness that followed. He spoke quietly but clearly, and every person in the courtroom listened to him. The 3 officers did not do well at the trial. They tried to say that Marcus had a weapon, but there was no weapon. They tried to say that Marcus had lunged at them, but the video showed he did not. They tried to say that they feared for their lives, but there was no evidence of that. Their own words and stories did not match the evidence. The jury could see that they were lying. After hearing all the evidence and all the witnesses, the jury talked together about what they had heard. It did not take them very long to decide. They decided that the officers were guilty of violating Marcus's civil rights, guilty of assault, guilty of conspiracy. The officers were convicted. They would go to prison. When the judge announced the sentences, all 3 officers received significant prison time. Dale Peterson received 12 years. James Mitchell received 10 years. David Chen received 8 years. These were long sentences. These officers would spend many years in federal prison as a result of what they had done to Marcus Johnson. In the courtroom, Sarah Johnson cried, but this time with relief and sadness together. Her son had been hurt badly, but now the men who hurt him would be punished. The system had worked. The truth had won. The trial changed more than just the fate of 3 officers. It changed the city. It changed the police department. Federal investigators looked closely at the police department and found many problems. They found that officers had been doing this kind of thing for many years, and nothing had been done about it. The federal government told the police department that they had to change. They had to fire officers who used too much force. They had to train officers differently. They had to stop allowing racial profiling. They had to be watched carefully to make sure they followed the rules. Marcus Johnson stayed in the hospital for several more months. He went through physical therapy to help his body heal. The doctor said he would walk again, but it would take time and hard work. He had scars on his body where the bullets had entered. These scars would be there forever. They would remind him forever of what had happened. But Marcus did something important. Instead of just trying to forget what had happened, he decided to talk about it. He decided to help other people. He started going to schools and talking to students about what had happened to him. He talked about racism. He talked about police violence. He talked about the importance of people standing up and telling the truth. He talked about the fact that the system could work if people insisted that it work. Marcus also worked with organizations that were fighting to change police practices. He told his story at rallies and meetings. He helped lawyers build cases against officers who were hurting people. He became a voice for people who had been hurt by police. The story of Marcus Johnson and the 3 officers who shot him became famous across the country. It became a story that people told when they talked about police reform and about standing up against injustice. It became proof that even when things seemed hopeless, change could happen. It became a reminder that truth and justice were possible. Years later, Marcus Johnson was still recovering, but he was stronger. He walked with some difficulty and he still had pain sometimes, but he walked. He talked to young people about what had happened to him. He worked to make sure that other people would not have to go through what he went through. He had survived being shot by police officers who did not know the truth. He had survived lies and cover-ups. He had survived because people had insisted on the truth, and he used the rest of his life to make sure that truth and justice won, for him and for others like him.